Chapter 11. Pat did a lot of intensive thinking while he rode back to a point where he could turn off the road westward. The fact that Sam and Ezra had not crossed the path convinced him that they had not expected him to follow. They must have heard the posse go past the crossroads in the wrong direction, he reasoned, and felt they were reasonably safe from pursuit. Thus, they wouldn't have ridden too fast, and probably planned to hole up during the daylight hours and do most of their riding at night, taking it by easy stages to the other pass and over the mountains to the Mexican border. They had had practically the entire night to make their first ride. That meant maybe 30 miles, or 40 at the most, and Ezra was a mighty big hunk of human flesh for any horse to carry fast or far. 30 miles would be more like it. Probably less, if Sam remained dead drunk very long and had to be tied to the saddle. That meant that they hadn't reached a point further than 10-15 miles west of the road by the time that sunup would have caught them. And that would have taken them just about to the old Windrow Range cabin, standing high and desolate on the northern slope of the mountain. Pat nodded with satisfaction when his reasoning took him to that point. The Windrow Line cabin was just about it. Sam and Ezra would have thought of it at once, for it was all affording an almost perfect stopping point for the dangerous daylight hours. Situated high upon the mountain slope, the only way to approach was by the front, and it gave down on a clear vista in that direction for almost 2 miles. There was a mountain-fed spring just behind the cabin, and plenty of feed for their horses. There was always a supply of canned goods and a stack of firewood inside the cabin for any stray rider who chanced to be caught by darkness in that vicinity, and Sam and Ezra knew that because they, with Pat, had made several overnight stops at the cabin in the past years. Having definitely decided that the Windrow cabin would have been the fugitives' objective, Pat began watching for the first favorable chance to turn off the road in that direction. He knew the point Sam and Ezra would have selected several miles further on, but by cutting a little further north due west, he could cross their route and save several precious miles. The descent was quite steep, winding sharply down the heavily wooded mountainside, but when it presented, it was cut by a shallow valley. Pat turned off the road without hesitation. The valley led almost due west, dropping downward at an easy grade, and flattened out after a few miles into a wide grassy park that stretched northward for many miles towards Dutch Springs. Pat reined his horse down to a slow trot as he started across the open park at an angle. If the calculations were correct, Sam and Ezra would have had to cross this same park to reach the Windrow cabin coming in from the northeast. The grass had been grazed to a short stubble by hungry cattle during the past season, giving a rider a fair chance to discern any fresh hoof prints that he might come upon. Pat leaned far forward in the saddle, resting his right forearm on the roan's neck and searching the ground carefully while he held to a slow pace. Luckily, there had been no horses pastured here, and the only tracks that were left were by the hooves of cows. He had progressed more than a mile along the park when he pulled his roan up with a grunt of satisfaction. He swung into the saddle and dropped to his knees to examine the prints of shod hooves heading southwesterly. Pat was only a fair trail reader, but it didn't require any particular ability to read those signs right. 2 horses had passed this way within a few hours. Their riders had not been pushing them, and the animals were not badly winded. That was about all that Pat could make out from the tracks, but it was all he needed. He took time to roll a cigarette before remounting. The tracks were heading straight in the direction of the Windrow cabin, about 4 miles distant. Pat was as sure as he'd find Sam and Ezra as he had been sure last night that Sally would be waiting up for him when he got back from town. He lit a cigarette and swung back onto the roan and turned him to follow the double set of tracks that was leading across the park. He didn't bother to follow the tracks, but rode erect in the saddle with his eyes fixed upon the mountainside, rising sharply from the edge of the park a couple miles distant. The lower portion of the mountain was dotted with juniper and scrub oaks. Higher up, along the point where he knew the cabin to be located, were towering pines, interspersed with clumps of quaking aspen. The small cabin was old and weathered, built of stout logs, and was difficult to make out against the rocky background until one was quite close to it. But Pat knew exactly where to look for it, and as he neared the edge of the park, his keen eyes picked it out. He stopped his horse to study the little cabin carefully, and a slow grin stretched his mouth wide. A tiny, thread-like wisp of vaporous smoke was rising from the chimney of the cabin. That was Sam and Ezra, all right. They'd be careful to build that kind of fire that would send up just a faint wisp of smoke, just like that. A very hot blaze of small dry sticks, carefully fed one at a time, so that the blaze remained uniform and hot, never letting it die away, yet never feeding it more wood at any time that it could consume swiftly and thoroughly. Pat had a funny feeling up in the pit of his stomach as he started his roan up the slope towards the cabin. One of them would certainly be on guard. He knew one of them must be watching him now. He must be reporting his presence to the other. One-eyed Ezra, with a scarred face and huge frame, or small, wiry, dark-featured Sam SLOAN. Pat could imagine the scene inside the cabin as he rode slowly onward up the exposed slope. The hurried confab, the consternation, and the efforts to identify the lone rider. How near would they let him come before they betrayed their presence in the cabin? They'd be certain now that he was no chance rider, if they only let him get close enough to shout to them, close enough so that they could see that he was Pat Stevens. He began to breathe a little more freely when he passed the halfway mark. Soon he'd be close enough for them to recognize him. A little further. The sharp crack of a rifle shattered his hopes. A small puff of smoke rose from the north window of the cabin, and a bullet sprang off a rock 10 feet in front of Pat. He pulled up his horse abruptly, stood in the stirrups, and put his hands to his mouth to trumpet up the hillside. "Sam! Ezra! It's Pat!" He waited anxiously, but there was no response from the cabin. It was still much too far for them to hear him, to recognize him, but it was plenty close for an accurate rifle shooting by either man. He had seen both of them break a deer's back at a mile too often to have any doubts about that. The first shot had meant merely as a warning. He knew their natures, knew neither of them had any desire to kill anyone, but he knew too also that they'd be grimly determined to keep him at his distance from the cabin. He had been with them in times of danger too much to hope that they would keep on bluffing. There might be another warning shot, or 2 or 3, but if he persisted in disregarding those, one of the next shots would be in earnest. He couldn't draw his own rifle and start shooting back. In the first place, they were well protected by the thick log walls, and he had no desire to shoot it out with them, even if the terms were even. He started his horse forward cautiously. He began to breathe again after the horse had gone 20 feet. Nothing happened. Then another puff of smoke rose from the tiny window far up the hill. This time the bullet sang angrily through the air past his head, and he instinctively ducked. He stopped his horse again, and his roan turned his head to peer at the rider with mild, speculative eyes. The roan seemed to be asking him, "How much longer are you going to be a damn fool? This man means business." Pat tried shouting again, but still it had no effect. No movement showed at the cabin, and after the echoes of the shot died away, there was a dead silence on the hillside. Pat slouched back in the saddle and vented his irritation with angry cussing. This was hell of a note. There were Sam and Ezra in the cabin, and here he was less than a mile away, and the situation would have been funny if it had not been so deadly serious. He was safe as long as he stayed where he was, but time was pressing. The Pony Express mail had to be carried into Dutch Springs before nightfall, and he had sent word that Sam would be riding with it. If he could only manage somehow to get close enough to yell at them. He remembered something, and relief surged upon him. That would do it. Behind the cabin was a shallow canyon that carried off the excess water from the spring. Quite narrow, and not more than 4 foot wide, it would offer shelter for a man on foot to approach within easy hailing distance of the cabin. He wheeled his horse down the slope, and spurred him into a gallop, made a wide circle that was well beyond a mile in radius from the cabin. He chuckled to himself as he imagined the emotions of Sam and Ezra watching him curiously. They wouldn't know what to make of the maneuver, and would be asking themselves whether they had frightened the rider off or whether this was merely some ruse. When he reached a point almost directly west of the cabin, and only a little lower level, he pulled his horse up and trotted him into a thick growth of cedar on the bank of the canyon. Out of sight of the cabin, he dismounted, ground-tied the roan, then cautiously crawled over the bank and down into the gully. It was a little deeper here than at the point directly behind the cabin, and he was able to stand erect and stay out of the small stream trickling alongside the bottom for quite a distance without being seen over the bank. Then it became narrower and shallower at the same time, and to remain concealed he was forced to bend low and splash along the rocky bottom through the icy water. His riding boots weren't waterproof, and the high heels made walking difficult along the slippery, wet rocks. Twice he fell to his knees, throwing his hands forward to break his fall, and splashing himself quite thoroughly. He cut his left knee on a sharp rock the second time he fell, and a sharp pain stabbed through the limb as he lurched onward, bent almost doubled. He lost all track of time and distance, was afraid to lift his head, look over the bank and get his bearings for fear that Sam and Ezra had guessed what he was up to and sent a bullet through his brain before he could shout to them. He was afraid also to start shouting too soon. If he warned them of his coming before he was close enough for them to recognize his voice, they might take fright and slip out of the cabin. So he went floundering on through the icy water, aware that he looked completely idiotic, but grimly determined to save his two friends from themselves if it was humanly possible to do so. He was beginning to wonder if he had somehow managed to pass beyond the cabin without knowing it, when his eyes saw the welcome sight of the spring just below the canyon. He knew the cabin must be directly below him, but he had no breath left to shout with, and he had to sink down onto a rock and rest a minute before he trusted his voice to carry even that short distance. When he was through gasping, he shouted, "Sam and Ezra, it's Pat. I'm right here behind the cabin, and I'm coming out. Do you hear me? It's Pat." He waited, strained his ears for a reply. He couldn't hear anything except the rustling of the mountain breeze in the pines and the irritating trickle of water between his feet. Still, not daring to expose himself to a bullet, he shouted again, loudly and angrily this time. When he got no answer to this, he began to wonder if he had made a mistake at the location of the cabin, and he cautiously poked his head over the bank to see. The cabin was right there, not more than 20 feet down the slope, and that same trickle of thin smoke spiraling upward from the chimney. Infuriated at his friends for their stubbornness in not answering, Pat dragged his wet, aching body out of the canyon and stalked down to the cabin. He flung the door open, stepped inside, and demanded angrily, "What the hell kind of game?" Emptiness flung his words back at him. He stared around the bare cabin in perplexity, and then limped to the door and around the corner. More than 2 miles away, he dimly saw the figures of 2 riders disappearing around the side of the mountain. He stood there frothing at the mouth in futile anger. While he had been engineering up the crick, falling on his face and cutting himself on rocks to get close enough to talk to them, his 2 friends had calmly seized the opportunity to saddle their horses and ride away. His own horses, they were now a mile distant away, and him with a cut leg and aching in every joint. It was enough, by golly, to make a man swear off friendship forever. Pat drew in a long breath, clamped his teeth over the cuss words that kept wanting to ooze out. He bent forward and began limping as rapidly as possible towards his horses. End of chapter 11.